In August 2025, headlines from CBS News and Fox 9 Minneapolis-St. Paul told a simple but unsettling story. A Walmart supercenter in Coon Rapids, Minnesota was shutting down, leaving 176 workers facing uncertain futures. Across the U.S., scattered closures followed: San Diego, Towson, Aurora, small in number but big in impact for their communities. At the same time, U.S. tariffs on imports had climbed to historic levels, driving up the cost of everything from beef to coffee. The official line was that these measures would protect American jobs, but consumers were already feeling the squeeze. If this is economic protection, what happens when the shield itself starts cutting both ways? For decades, Walmart has been a cornerstone of American retail, its blue and yellow logo as familiar in small towns as in sprawling suburbs. In the early 2000s and well into the 2010s, the chain's growth seemed unstoppable, expanding beyond U.S. borders, integrating sophisticated supply chains, and mastering the balance between low prices and vast selection. In both the U.S. and Canada, Walmart became not just a store, but an essential part of the grocery and household economy. Families relied on its promise of everyday low prices, and local economies benefited from the steady flow of jobs, tax revenues, and affordable goods. Yet beneath this stability, subtle shifts were already taking place. By the late 2010s, competition from e-commerce giants like Amazon forced Walmart to pour billions into digital infrastructure, same-day delivery, and store remodeling. Then came the disruptions of the early 2020s, pandemic-era supply shocks, inflationary pressures, and political instability in trade policy. Canada's role in this story grew more complex. As one of Walmart's most important international markets and a key supplier of agricultural products to U.S. shelves, it was deeply tied to the health of cross-border commerce. The turning point began to crystallize in 2024 and 2025. Tariff battles, particularly the reciprocal tariff policy introduced under Executive Order 14,257 in April 2025, added a layer of uncertainty that rippled through Walmart's intricate supply web. Import costs for everything from electronics to apparel spiked, while grocery categories like beef and coffee started inching higher month by month. In the U.S., some stores, particularly those underperforming or in older formats, were quietly closed, even as Walmart accelerated investment in new supercenters and remodels elsewhere. North of the border, Canadian suppliers began recalculating margins, wondering how long they could absorb U.S. tariff shocks without passing them on to consumers. The golden era of retail certainty had given way to a far more unpredictable game. The fracture in the retail and trade landscape became undeniable on April 2, 2025, when the White House unveiled Executive Order 14257, a sweeping reciprocal tariff framework. Under its terms, the United States would impose a baseline 10% tariff on imports from countries whose duties on U.S. goods were deemed excessive, with adjustments upward depending on the trade imbalance. Supporters framed it as a bold move to restore fairness in global trade, targeting nations like China, Mexico, and the European Union. President Trump's administration positioned the policy as a direct shot against what they called decades of predatory trade practices that hollowed out American manufacturing. The first wave of tariff adjustments hit hardest in sectors like electronics, home goods, apparel, and certain agricultural imports. By mid-summer, the baseline for Chinese goods had surged to 30% under the temporary truce negotiated in early August. The administration touted this as a win. China had been kept from hiking its retaliatory tariffs to triple-digit levels, at least for 90 days. But the price pressures at home were already mounting. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported a 2.4% year-over-year increase in the food-at-home CPI in June 2025. Within that basket, meats, poultry, fish, and eggs rose 5.6%, with ground beef hitting an all-time high of $6.12 per pound. Coffee prices climbed 2.2% in a single month. These weren't abstract figures. They were reflected in shopping carts across America, from suburban supercenters to rural outposts, where Walmart's presence is often the only shield against food deserts. Inside Walmart's headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas, executives faced a strategic puzzle. The retailer's grocery dominance, accounting for nearly a quarter of all U.S. grocery spending, gave it leverage to negotiate with suppliers and smooth out some of the volatility. But in non-grocery categories, tariffs were eating into margins. Higher input costs on electronics, apparel, and household goods meant one of two things: absorb the hit or pass it on to consumers already feeling the strain. The company's public message emphasized resilience. In January 2024, Walmart had committed to opening or converting more than 150 stores over 5 years and remodeling 650 within 12 months. By 2025, Texas alone saw 67 remodel projects and multiple new supercenters in cities like Cypress, Frisco, and Melissa. Yet the closures, such as the one in Coon Rapids, Minnesota, were a reminder that not all locations could weather the storm. Each shutdown brought headlines, even if the overall numbers remained small compared to Walmart's massive footprint. The administration, for its part, dismissed these closures as isolated events unrelated to tariffs, citing long-term corporate restructuring trends. Still, economic think tanks like the Yale Budget Lab warned that the short-term impact of the 2025 tariff package could push consumer prices up by 1.8% to 2.3%, assuming high pass-through rates. Oxford Analytica went further, suggesting that the uncertainty itself, businesses unsure of what the next quarter's tariff schedule might look like, was enough to freeze expansion plans and disrupt inventory strategies. For many Americans, this policy wasn't just a line item in a trade report. It was something they could feel in the checkout line. And for Walmart, a company that has built its empire on undercutting the competition, the new tariff regime was not just an operational challenge, but a direct test of its identity as the low-price leader. While the U.S. government sold its new reciprocal tariff regime as a tool for restoring balance, in Canada the reaction was swift, uneasy, and layered with frustration. Canada had already been navigating its own cost of living pressures, food inflation, supply chain bottlenecks, and a Canadian dollar that had slid against the U.S. greenback in the first half of 2025. The April announcement of Executive Order 14257 immediately set off alarms for Canadian exporters, especially those whose livelihoods depended on cross-border shipments to U.S. distribution hubs like Walmart's regional centers. Agricultural sectors felt the pressure first. Beef producers in Alberta and Saskatchewan, who had long counted on steady orders from U.S. retail giants, faced new uncertainties. With the U.S. slapping a 10% baseline tariff on certain processed meat imports, Canadian suppliers either had to absorb the cost or risk pricing themselves out of Walmart's procurement lists. Industry associations warned that even a short disruption could ripple into layoffs, reduced slaughterhouse capacity, and livestock price volatility. The grocery channel, where Walmart Canada and Walmart US maintain deep integration, was another stress point. Canadian-grown produce, seafood from Atlantic fisheries, and specialty packaged goods that crossed southward every week were suddenly more expensive for U.S. buyers. Some contracts were renegotiated at lower volumes, forcing Canadian suppliers to scramble for alternative markets, often at thinner margins. On the retail side, Walmart Canada had its own balancing act. While the Canadian arm of the company was not directly hit by U.S. tariffs on imports from Canada, it operated in a competitive environment where price-matching policies and shared supplier networks meant that cost pressures in the U.S. could bleed northward. For example, if a multinational food brand raised its North American wholesale prices to offset tariff costs in the U.S., Canadian shelves might see a parallel increase, even without a formal tariff applied. Politically, Ottawa signaled it would seek exemptions or negotiate sector-specific relief, but trade analysts warned that Canada's leverage was limited. The U.S. was Canada's largest export destination by a wide margin, and the new tariff framework was broad enough to be applied with little warning. Canadian officials also had to consider the optics. Retaliating too aggressively risked fueling a trade spat that could damage more sectors, while staying quiet risked appearing passive to domestic constituencies. The Canadian media framed the moment as another test of economic sovereignty. Editorials in major outlets like The Globe and Mail and CBC News drew comparisons to the 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs, when Canada's countermeasures targeted U.S. whiskey, orange juice, and even ketchup. But unlike that earlier episode, the 2025 tariffs came with the complication of inflation already at uncomfortable levels. Raising prices further, whether through retaliation or pass-through effects, risked alienating voters just as the next federal election cycle loomed. In smaller communities, the anxiety was less about geopolitics and more about survival. A fish processing plant in Newfoundland that sold a quarter of its output to U.S. retailers had already delayed expansion plans, citing market uncertainty. In rural Manitoba, a produce cooperative that shipped carrots and potatoes south said its profit margins were razor thin after currency swings and higher freight costs. For these operations, Walmart was more than a buyer. It was a dependable anchor customer. Any disruption in that relationship threatened not just the business, but the jobs and stability of entire towns. In short, Canada's response was defined by caution, quiet lobbying, and contingency planning. But beneath the surface was a growing recognition. If the U.S. chose to escalate tariffs or shift sourcing strategies more aggressively toward domestic producers, Canada's most export-reliant sectors could find themselves sidelined in a market they had helped supply for decades. By late summer 2025, the U.S.-Canada retail and trade dynamic had settled into a tense holding pattern. The 90-day U.S.-China tariff truce provided temporary breathing room, but it did nothing to resolve the structural friction between Washington and Ottawa. Every move seemed to carry equal risk: de-escalate and you appear weak, push forward and you risk collateral damage to industries that can't easily recover. In Washington, trade officials argued that the tariff framework was working as intended, signaling toughness while forcing partners to come to the table. But the metrics they cited didn't capture the uncertainty on the ground: delayed purchase orders, slimmed-down shipments, and the quiet retreat of small suppliers unable to navigate new cost structures. In Ottawa, policymakers weighed a mix of quiet diplomacy and selective pressure tactics, but the political appetite for an open fight was muted by domestic inflation fatigue. For Walmart, the world's largest retailer, this was a paradox. On paper, the company was still expanding, remodeling stores, opening supercenters, and investing in online logistics. Yet operational teams were juggling a supply map in flux. U.S. tariffs made some Canadian goods pricier, Canadian suppliers were hesitating to scale production, and consumers on both sides of the border were becoming more price-sensitive. The standoff wasn't just about trade, it was about identity. Was North America still committed to deep economic integration, or was it drifting toward a patchwork of national-first policies? Without a clear resolution, both countries risked cementing a new normal where mistrust and volatility replaced the decades of predictable partnership that once defined the cross-border retail economy. In rural Alberta, the town of High River has long been synonymous with beef production. Here, a major processing plant supplies not just domestic grocery chains, but also Walmart distribution hubs south of the border. Under normal circumstances, the plant runs at near full capacity, moving thousands of pounds of beef weekly into U.S. markets. But since April 2025, tariff-driven cost increases have quietly squeezed the operation's margins. The 10% baseline tariff on certain processed meats bound for U.S. stores doesn't sound dramatic on paper, but when coupled with higher feed costs, a weaker Canadian dollar, and elevated freight rates, the math quickly turns unforgiving. Management faces stark choices: absorb the tariff hit and erode profitability, or raise prices and risk losing Walmart's long-term contracts. Either way, the ripple effects are tangible. Some shifts have been cut back, overtime hours are down, and hiring for seasonal workers has been postponed. The Canadian Cattlemen's Association warns that if these conditions persist into 2026, smaller feedlots will shutter, pushing ranch families into financial jeopardy. Seafood exporters in Newfoundland tell a similar story. One fish processing cooperative, which sends nearly a quarter of its annual output to U.S. buyers, has frozen expansion plans for a new facility. The cooperative's board cites market uncertainty and the need to keep reserves high in case U.S. tariffs increase further or buyer volumes are reduced. At a national level, the data underscores the fragility. According to Statistics Canada, nearly 72% of Canadian agri-food exports go to the U.S. That dependency turns every policy shift in Washington into an immediate economic variable in Canadian boardrooms. Ottawa's current approach, quiet lobbying in D.C. and discrete sector-specific relief measures, may blunt some short-term pain. But for communities tied tightly to Walmart's purchasing power, the shared market integration that once felt like an asset now feels like a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Across the border in Oklahoma, a Walmart supercenter in a low-income county serves as the only full-service grocery store within a 20-mile radius. For residents, it's not just a retail outlet, it's a lifeline. But the store's managers have watched as wholesale costs creep up week after week, particularly in categories with heavy cross-border supply chains. Packaged seafood from Canada is pricier. Beef from Alberta arrives at higher cost, forcing difficult decisions on shelf pricing. For low-income shoppers, even small increases are significant. According to USDA data, over 50% of Oklahoma's grocery market share belongs to Walmart, and nearly a third of the state's population lives in low-income, low-access LILA areas. When prices rise in a market like this, the immediate effect is reduced food security. Some customers shift to cheaper, calorie-dense but less nutritious foods. Others reduce the variety of their diets altogether. The broader retail ecosystem isn't immune. Walmart's U.S. teams have to recalibrate inventory strategies to accommodate shifting consumer behavior. If certain Canadian imports are priced out of the market, substitution becomes necessary. But alternative suppliers often bring their own cost challenges, especially if domestic producers know they're in a stronger negotiating position. That, in turn, can drive further price escalation, feeding back into the inflationary loop the tariffs were supposed to help control. Even beyond the store level, there's an economic cost to uncertainty. Local trucking companies that once counted on steady cross-border loads have seen contracts reduced or renegotiated. Small suppliers who serviced Walmart indirectly through logistics, packaging, or specialty goods find themselves squeezed as procurement departments trim non-essential spending to offset higher input prices. In theory, the tariffs were designed to shield American workers and producers. In practice, they've created a chain reaction in which communities like this Oklahoma County bear the brunt. Proof that in an integrated economy, the pain doesn't stop neatly at the border. By August 2025, the U.S. and Canada found themselves standing at the same crossroads, looking in opposite directions. The tariff war hadn't brought a decisive win for either side, only higher prices, tighter margins, and communities questioning how long they could endure. Walmart's footprint remained vast, but its role as a stabilizing force in the North American retail landscape was under strain. The promise of everyday low prices now competed with the reality of unpredictable costs and political brinkmanship. So the question lingers, will Washington and Ottawa choose to rebuild trust in their economic alliance, or let short-term tactics harden into long-term barriers? In the end, the answer may determine whether the world's most integrated cross-border retail network can still work for the people it was built to serve. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth reports.